What's Your Work Fit is sponsored by Hudson Davis Companies. Start your brand's marketing and communications journey today at hudsondaviscommunications.com and hudsondaviscreative.com. I'm Dan Smolin. I built a successful executive career in marketing and communications before becoming a top headhunter and founding my own executive search firm. Now get this, every day, mainstream media runs stories in which old school bosses and thought leaders frame your work and workplace issues in ways that are often divisive and unmeaningful. And that's just crazy. The time has come for you to answer the question, what's your work fit? So that your work and career fit who you are, how you want to live, and what you want your lasting contributions to be. What's your work fit? It answers your questions and tackles the issues that keep you up at night about advancing your career in this time of workplace revolution. So let's get started. Hey, good day everyone, Dan Smolin here. Welcome to everyone across North America and around the world. I so appreciate you joining us today. We're going to get started very quickly, but before we do, I have an ask, and that is, if you submit a future question that we pick for a future live show, we will send you this embroidered What's Your Work Fit cap. It's made in America, high quality. That's all I ask. We drive this show based on your questions. Okay, everyone, let's get started. I want to introduce to you our guest today, Jonathan D. Salant. Jonathan is an award-winning journalist and the newly appointed assistant managing editor for politics at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. He led the Washington Bureau for New Jersey. He includes several newspaper. And prior to that, he had numerous roles, including being a Washington-based reporter for Bloomberg and also the AP, the Associated Press. His expertise includes campaign finance, lobbying, politics, and I don't think you'll mind this, Jonathan. I call you a reporter's reporter. You are a current member of the Standing Committee of Correspondents, the former National Press Club president, former Regional Reporters Association president, and former president of the DC chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. Welcome, Jonathan, to What's Your Work Fit.
Glad to be here.
Great to have you. I've been so looking forward to this. I want to get to a viewer question that was posed a few months back before we knew you were going to be a guest on this show, and it is from Rachel. Rachel is a rising college senior who loves to write and loves questioning authority. She loves speaking truth to power, but also getting people on the record and understanding really how government works and how the press and being a reporter can be an important part of society. She says this is her passion. This is what she wants to be, even though her parents worry that she won't make enough to live on. But in the end, she says, this is what I know I want to do. I want to interview people and I want to report the news in my community. She wants to start off as a local reporter. So with that said, how can journalism be my work fit? How can it be Rachel's work fit, Jonathan?
Well, it sounds like this is exactly what she wants to do. And
right.
Go into journalism. The thing is journalism is not a 9-to-5 job. And it's, I used to joke, my bureau would say, we were a 24/7 news service. Nobody ever told me I didn't have to work 24/7. Even in the new job, a couple of weeks ago, we had the Senator John Fetterman, our new senator of Pennsylvania,
right,
who had checked into a hospital for depression. He had a stroke. It's a normal, I guess, byproduct of when you have a stroke, get depressed. And he's been doing an interview on Sunday morning. He's my local senator. It's a story to cover. And I tell my editor, I got to work Sunday morning. In fact, I missed a softball doubleheader for it. But we got to cover it. And he was like amazed that I felt the need to be working on a Sunday, which should be my day off. But that's when news happens. News doesn't call you and say, What's your schedule like? So you've got to be willing to work when there is news, no matter when it is. Remember when they U.S. attacked Iraq,
Right.
and it's what 12 hours difference. So at 3 o'clock in the morning, I got to be on call to get local reaction if something like that happens. So you have to be. It's a commitment. I know when my wife, a friend of yours, she's in retail, and they warned her and they said, it's going to be nights and weekends sometimes. She said, my husband's a journalist. That was all she had to say.
Take us back to your origin story, Jonathan. I know you grew up in Long Island. And by the way, your wife, Bonnie, and I are the oldest of friends. We go back to preschool. She is my oldest friend, even though I'm older than her. So take us back to your journalism origin story. So let's say you're in middle school, high school. What's happening to you that's getting you inspired about pursuing a career as a journalist?
Well, I was always interested in journalism, and like in junior high school, I put out my own newspaper. We put it out, distributed to the class, news of the class. I had a couple of friends working with me on it. We passed it around, and people would read it. I was an editor of my junior high school paper, and I was news editor of my high school paper. And then I go into college, and Watergate hits, and you saw what a newspaper could do to check on government and check on power that the news media would do. And in my religion, we have something called Tikkun Olam, Jewish religion, which is literally heal the world. And that's one of our mandates to do that. So I could see the journalism would let me do Tikkun Olam. You could really make the world a better place, highlight problems, hold public accountable to the public. And it became a natural fit. Plus, I'm always interested in politics. I have an extensive political button collection. I get to cover political campaigns, and I get to talk to politicians, and I get to go to places nobody else gets to go to. I went to the White House when Rabin shook Arafat's hand.
Oh boy!
I was at the 1984 Democratic National Convention when Mario Cuomo, the governor I was covering, because I was covering New York politics at the time, gives that wonderful speech that made him a national figure overnight. It's things like that. I've just shown up at places because I have a press pass, and it lets me go and see what's going on and witness history.
I'm such a news nerd, and I covered the 80 Democratic Convention in Madison Square Garden, which was astonishing for a lot of reasons. One was just how accessible the floor was for me, this young guy who was in college as a journalist for a radio station. And I got to put a mic up in the face of practically anyone and ask a question, including Jimmy Carter, which was thrilling at the time that I, a mere, at the time, 19-year-old kid, could do something like that and report back to, at the time, the local community of Ithaca, New York, what I was learning about the New York delegation, what the local congressman at the time had to say about the convention and so forth. What's changed about news that doesn't allow that kind of freedom?
Well, you still have a lot of the freedom at the conventions. And so you still can go onto the floor and you can go to people, and there's the governor of your state sitting in his seat. And I took my son to the 2012 Democratic Convention in Charlotte. He was studying AP, national, state, and local government and politics. And I said to myself, he could spend a week in a classroom learning it. He could spend a week in Charlotte seeing it.
Right.
And I took him, and he met Barney Frank. He met John Lewis, who he just studied in the American history. He met all sorts of other big politicians because they're all around. So you can still do that. The problem is that too many people now are into, let's take our smartphone and let's stick it in somebody's face and have them say something stupid. And then we'll tweet it out, and we'll get 1 million clicks, and we'll go viral. And so lawmakers, frankly, justifiably, are nervous about it. They don't want to talk off the cuff. It's really hard to get people like that now. You can't just walk to a lot of people. They don't want to do that. I have a reputation of not asking. That's not the questions I'm asking. I'm asking substantial questions, and they appreciate it, and they will still talk to me on the cuff. because I'm going to be asking a real question. And what happens in some cases, one lawmaker who didn't want to come out when I needed to talk to him, and you could request people in the House to come out and just talk to you, and you send through a sergeant at arms, you send a card and say, I'm out here, I'd like to talk to you. And one of the guys was saying, well, meet me on the first floor, not the second floor, because he didn't want to be bombarded with all these questions he didn't want to answer, most of which are sensational questions. He didn't want to deal with that. He wanted to ask, the real questions.
I want to take this conversation to local, because local interests me. I think it's something that, and correct me if I'm wrong, historically in the United States has been very important. If you really want to nerd out historically and go back to the New Deal, when the FCC really championed the notion of localism, that we give licenses to local broadcast entities, and with the trust that they will cover their local communities. And back then, right, they used to have to meet the threshold of local reporting in order to get their license renewal. We don't have that anymore. We've abandoned, to a certain extent, that localism. And I think local stories, especially in communities that are outside of big metropolitan areas, just they don't get told, right?
Well, the thing originally with the FCC is there's a finite, or was a finite, number of television frequencies. So they had to regulate newspapers. Anybody can put out a newspaper just to buy
Right.
printing press, or now just a copying machine, or now just a website. But you can't. There's only certain number of television stations. I mean, you grew up in New Haven. You had channels like 3 and 8, or Connecticut 3 and 8. You couldn't have 2, 4, 5, and 7 and 9 and 11 and 13, because they were assigned to New York City, which is close enough that they would interfere.
Right.
So they had to limit. Over the years, with deregulation, you saw in a lot of industries. So in the electric industry, the telephone industry, to name two industries, the trucking industry, the airline industry, where the government stopped picking winners and losers, and the government basically said, you can go out there. And with cable TV, there are a million channels. And when you're looking at your cable thing, you don't think, oh, well, Channel 4 is a over-the-air broadcast station, and MSNBC or Fox is a cable station, different regulations, but on the cable, they all look alike. So you didn't have the government decide to get out of the business. Now you talk about, there used to be rules, again, because there was a finite number of television stations. You had to give both sides equal time on an issue. You couldn't have candidate X and not have candidate Y on. It's not fair. You had something called the fairness doctrine, where if you were going to talk about an issue, you had to make sure both sides were heard on the air. Because remember, you were the only game in town in terms of being a broadcast person. One of those things was the Supreme Court got rid of it in a case involving WTVH-TV. And the reason I know that is because it was a Syracuse TV station. I was in Washington for the Syracuse newspapers, and I covered that Supreme Court case.
Wow. Well, I remember in college, and this is pretty arcane, but we talked about a TV station in Boston, WNAC. That call sign might have switched to something else, but at the time, they lost their license because they lied on their application. It was a famous FCC case. That stuff doesn't happen anymore. I'll give you another thing that's changed, and even though I grew up in New Haven a little bit, my teenage years were in the Washington D.C. area, so I got to see what happens to media in that market. Now, back then, Jonathan, and you probably know this, the ABC station way back then was owned by the old Washington Star. The CBS station was owned by the Washington Post. And in the mid 70s to the late 1970s, both those entities were forced to sell because the FCC didn't want a concentration of one voice in a media market. So Channel 9 got sold to another company, and they swapped with a station in Detroit. So the Washington Post now owned a station in Detroit, not in D.C. That doesn't happen anymore. Just the opposite.
Well, no, it's still regulations. You still can't own. Syracuse owned radio and TV, and they had to sell them.
Right.
Again, it's diversity of interest. And you mentioned Boston, where Ted Kennedy once got through a provision because Rupert Murdoch owned the New York Post and Channel 5 in New York, and he owned the Boston Herald, and he owned the Fox station in Boston. And the Congress actually passed the law basically saying you can't own both of them.
Right.
And Murdoch sold the Boston Herald, and actually at one point sold the New York Post. And when it was about to go under, he got a waiver to keep the Post, because if you want to have a diversity of interests and there's no interest because it's gone out of business, what are you doing? So they let him keep the Post. So he still owns the New York Post, and he owns NYW now, Channel 5 in New York. But a lot of folks, you get rid of it. And even some of the big newspapers, the big news chains, I mean, Gannett split. They have a newspaper division and a broadcast division now.
Right.
Tribune sold all his stations. I mean, WGN in Chicago stood for World's Greatest Newspaper, which was the slogan of the Chicago Tribune. WPIX in New York, PIX. Why is it PIX? Picture. Daily News, New York's PIX newspaper.
Right.
That's how all that was. But questions, though, then they all consolidate. The broadcasting sound. There's no local, at least with if the Washington Post is owned Channel 9 in Washington, it's a local company. Now it is because Gannett's right across the river in Arlington. But a lot of these said the Washington Post owns WPLG in and I don't know, Phil Graham owns it in Miami. But they have no local interest in that. There's no local person there. It's all owned elsewhere, and there's nobody really has a feel for the local community.
So I wanted to get to a viewer comment. Randall J. wrote, "This week I attended a contentious school board meeting in my community, and I recorded portions of it on my iPhone." And he's posting a story about it in a local blog. We talked about your aversion to people sticking phones in the faces of important people to get them on the record, but do so in a gotcha kind of way, which is not Jonathan's way of doing things as an honest broker. But how important could having a blog to do local reporting be to somebody who wants to establish a journalism career?
Well, again, and the Pearls Against Swine, the comic strip, does this all the time, and all these things where you have a bunch of us trained in journalism. I mean, journalism. The joke is journalism is not a profession anybody can do it, and you can. The First Amendment allows anybody to call themselves a journalist.
Right.
But there are certain conventions that you learn and you practice and you believe in to be a real journalist. And with newspapers going under and people being laid off, there aren't those folks, but they're replaced by some people, frankly, who you don't know where they're coming from. I don't know this person's blogger, but I could go to a school board meeting and just take that little snippet of the two people fighting with each other and saying big issue arises at school board meeting. And it's a 3-hour meeting, and for 2 hours and 59 minutes, none of that is happening. One thing gets all the clicks and all the attention, but that's not really what's going on. Or do you have a background in education, the issues? Have you talked to people to find out what's going on? Maybe it was an issue that riled up the community, or maybe it's one or two people, a small minority that doesn't like what's going on. And you can, at a school board meeting nicely, you have the First Amendment right to go there and protest. But who are they? Who are they representing? I'm glad the person's there. But again, what did they see and what did they know? And I think they trained, but they have any experience in how to report fairly and accurately, or just let's stick a video out there and with no context at all.
I have a really great question queued up for you, but I want to ask you about the importance of having an editor to report to, who pushes back on you, who helps mold you, who helps you avoid burying the lead, so to speak. Talk about your experience. I mean, you're a managing editor now, but when you were a young reporter in Syracuse and in Miami and some of the other communities, how important was that person to you in making you become a better reporter, Jonathan?
Well, very important. First of all, even now, I need an editor. Mm-hmm. I've been in this business, more than 40 years. I still need an editor. Too many stories now because all the newspapers eliminated the copy desks, and you have one person back reading you stuff. There are typos, and I will go through my stories later on because you link to old stories, and there are typos in it. I've corrected 2 or 3 year old stories, not big deals, no factual errors, but I misspelled a word, I left out a period, there was a sentence fragment that I forgot to delete. So it's really important. And if you're a reader and you see misspelled words and you see mistakes, common mistakes, sometimes just sloppy, you're writing too fast, things like that, and you know that to be false, why would you believe anything else we write? If the thing you know about is false, why would you take my word that everything else is true? Oh yeah, everything's right except for that one thing you noticed. So that's a problem with that. But also editors, have experience. They've been where you were for the most part. They face the same questions. Sometimes they come up with wonderful questions. I had an editor in Syracuse who came from Nebraska, and he moved to Syracuse. He was my editor, and he'd ask questions like, why? I'm covering New York politics for years. It's always that way. What do you mean, why? He said, no, it's not that way. Nebraska, it's not that way. In this other place where I worked, it's not that way. I got some great stories out of it just by asking a simple question because I took it for granted. This is the way it always was. That helped a lot. And also sometimes they make your stories real better. The best lead I never wrote. I'm covering a zoning board meeting in Miami where they want to have they want to have a high-rise mausoleum because they're running out of room to bury people. And the lead of the story that I didn't write, my editor wrote, and it was a great lead. That's why I remember it, 40 years later, Miami Memorial Park, a cemetery with a space problem, wants to raise the dead. I mean, how do you now in today's world with you need to get SEOs and clicks, you have some really wonderful headlines from editors who are trained in this, and to attract people to get to your stories. And you almost got to sell a story. It's like the guy in the old days, the guy in the street corner, extra, read all about it. You got to put a headline on the web that grabs the reader. They're not even going to stay for the first paragraph if the headline doesn't grab them. And that's what you need. That's a big thing that the editors can do.
So I mentioned before we hit live that a dear friend of mine who's a pretty well-known name in media circles, at least she was for many years, is Andrea Koppel. And Andrea had pretty much the same beat as you have now. She was a congressional correspondent at CNN. She left that business. She did other things. And now she is helping young people, primarily, pivot out of college into meaningful career tracks. I reached out to Andrea and said, hey, you got to join me on the show. And she said, I am away this week, but I will ask Jonathan a question. So here we go. Andrea asks, should future journalists develop subject matter expertise in topics that interest them? As examples, renewable energy, politics, economics, cybersecurity, rather than go to a J school and major in journalism. What are your thoughts on that, Jonathan?
Well, I didn't major in journalism undergraduate. I was a political science major. In fact, my entire undergraduate journalism education consisted of 2 courses and putting out a newspaper came out 3 times a week. That's what my journalism education was. And believe me, when you're writing a story, especially with your classmates in it and your dorm mates, you better make sure it's right because you're going to face them the next morning. So that's how I got my journalism education. I wound up getting a master's in journalism because eventually I wanted to teach, and you need a master's to teach. I figured when I retired, I'd go teach, but my retirement date keeps being pushed back and more back and back. So yeah, you should have an expert. You're more employable with an expertise. Where when I went to Bloomberg, I was the Associated Press's campaign finance and lobbying reporter. So I knew the Federal Election Commission inside and out, and I had computer skills. So when Bloomberg News wants a campaign finance reporter, not only do I have the experience as a journalist for a zillion years, but I also have that expertise. I can come right in there. The last 2 jobs I got in journalism for New Jersey Advanced Media, and now for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. They hired me because I had all decades of Washington experience. I know how Washington works. I know where, I don't say where bodies are buried, but I know how it works, what it means to introduce a bill, what it means to vote, why things are not going to pass, who to talk to. We have John Fetterman, I mentioned at the beginning. He comes back after, and so I'm talking to people. There's a closed door meeting. The Senate Democrats meet every Tuesday behind closed doors. They have a luncheon. So I can talk to all these people that I know afterwards. Cory Booker, who I covered in New Jersey. Ben Cardin, I hosted our synagogue, our political forum. And I'm a Marylander. So even though I sound like a New Yorker. So I know these people, and I can go up to them, what happened? And they know who I am. I'm not trying to get them to say something stupid. They give me the details. I can write a story that John Fetterman was applauded, and he said, thank you. And people came up to him and they welcomed him back, and they were so happy to see him. I'm not there. People have to tell me that. They have to be willing to trust me that I'm going to describe what they tell me accurately. But because I have a relationship with these people, I can get that information. So that's a Washington expertise. If you have, certainly in certain areas, and renewable energy, as Andrea said, that's a hot topic. If you know that stuff, that can really help you. We got a reporter, Lisa Friedman, at the New York Times, who's one of their big environmental reports. She started working for a specialty publication that covers energy and environment. And then the New York Times hires her because of her expertise. So that's not a bad way to get to the New York Times.
So I want to deal with the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which was your recent exit out of New Jersey Advanced Media, and we talked a little bit about it. And I was familiar with your role there. I know that the communities that you served are in the state with the most population density in the United States. This was not, you weren't working for the Tulsa newspaper or the Dubuque newspaper or some, in Brattleboro, Vermont or something. You were providing news to your readers back in New Jersey, which is a very dense community. I know that the congressional delegation almost universally was outraged that your bureau was closed down and you were out of a job. And I'm wondering if you could share with us some of their feelings about that and why they felt that your absence and the bureau's absence was going to be so palpable.
Well, it's still, I'm still getting my head around that. It's totally unexpected.
Yeah.
And I've left jobs before, and people say it's a pleasure working with you. And especially in Washington, loads of newspapers close their bureaus. They decide they don't want a Washington person. You're cutting back. So who do you cut? You cut the City Hall reporter who you see every day, who's covering the local mayor, because that you can't get the information any other way. I mean, New York Times isn't covering the Dubuque mayor, but the New York Times will write a story about Chuck Grassley in Iowa. You won't have an Iowa angle to it, but at least you know what something that the senator is up to. And so it's easy to, and in Washington, they don't see you. I made it a point to come up every so often to Trenton just to be seen. Right. They don't see you. All I know is what they read and what they read from you. And so to a lot of these papers, it's easy to get rid of the Washington person. And you don't really replace the coverage, but you can replace the Washington dateline. It's not so easy to replace the Dubuque dateline with the Washington Post and the New York Times. And that's the argument that these lawmakers made, that I was reporting what they were doing. I was telling the public. I always say, I call it holding public officials accountable to the public. I have a desk at the Capitol, in fact, where I'm coming to you from now. And I have that desk because I believe the First Amendment gives me the moral responsibility. It gives me the access that I need to fulfill my moral responsibility to hold public officials accountable to the public. When you elect a member of Congress from wherever you live, and he or she goes down to Washington, you're not there to see what they're doing. You can't get down here. It's far and it's expensive. And you don't have the access I have. I have the access. I can tell you what they're up to. I can tell you who they're meeting with, how they're voting, who's funding their campaigns, both good and bad, and write those stories. And when I was in Jersey, I was the last one. When I started the job almost 9 years ago, there were 4 of us covering New Jersey. By the time I left, I was the only one.
Wow.
And the lawmakers knew that. I was their way of reaching the public. They could run ads, but as one lawmaker told me, you can run ads, yeah, but nobody's holding us accountable for what we say, and we can say anything we want because it's a paid advertisement. And this way, I was fact checking them. I was keeping them honest. I was letting them know that we were watching, and I was telling the public what they were up to. Otherwise, they have no real good way of getting out their message. A lot of people do well. I mean, public service is a honorable profession. Remember, it's the old saying in journalism, if dog bites man, it's not news, but if man bites dog, it is news. As long as the corrupt politician's on page 1, that's a good sign how healthy our government is in terms of ethics, because it's still out of the ordinary. And so I'm in there keeping an eye on these folks and telling what they have and letting the public know what their officials. Sometimes it's really important. If there's a lawmaker, Chris Smith, the longest serving lawmaker in the House now, and the only reason he's not dean of the House is Hal Rogers, at the same time, has a name earlier in the alphabet. But Chris Smith is there, and a couple from Jersey, their daughter, same age as my son, gets into a fake Uber coming back from a bar, and the driver murders her. So at the same time, I'm going to make plans for my son's college graduation. They're making plans for their daughter's funeral.
Wow.
And they lobbying Congress. I'm there in the room. They let me in the room when they're talking to lawmakers. Like, please support. They wound up getting a bill. It was not as much as they wanted, but they wound up getting a bill passed that named for their daughter. And all these parents are very powerful lobbyists because they want to make sure that their son or daughter or their mother or father did not die in vain. And this way their spouse, their relative's life had meaning. It's very powerful. It's a very powerful story. But I'm there to report it back. There's a story. In fact, they still run my picture to this day of the congressman and the couple sitting together in a room talking about this issue. Nobody else is there. Now, if it happens tomorrow, nobody will be there.
So Stu Katz wanted to ask a question, and he apologizes. He submitted this in advance. He wants to know about how you roll, and he recognizes that you're sort of a pioneer in doing remote work. I mean, I've been at your house when you've pulled yourself away and you've worked in your study or whatever, and you work where you need to work. He's asking, what advice can you give to those who may work a majority of their time remotely, either by their own choice or by their employer's decisions? How do you make it work? And how have you made it work all these years, Jonathan?
Well, you don't have an office, and you have no choice to do it. And sometimes it's really easy. I mean, it takes me. I save 2 hours of my day if I work from home. So in a week, that's 10 hours. Even I gave 5 hours back to the company, I still save 5 hours. I save $75 a week in commuting expenses. It's less now because I get half price Metro fares because I'm older. But it's only $50 a week now, with parking and everything else. But so it's important. But you're not with people. There's too many times where, and I come down to the Capitol now almost every day because people are here. This is where the people I'm covering are here. You never know what comes up. Your editor asks you to get a quote from somebody, or you see something that's breaking, or you hear something, or at 10 o'clock they announce at 10:30 we're going to have a press conference, and we're going to have with the Speaker of the House and 3 lawmakers, 2 of which are from the community you're covering. I can't get down immediately, and you can watch it on TV, but then you can't ask the questions. You can't go up to somebody afterwards and say, I didn't understand what you were saying. Could you please repeat it? Or did I hear you correctly? We want to be accurate. So I like people around. It can be pretty lonely. There are people who talk about, they could go to work in pajamas, and they can do this and they can do that. And frankly, like today, I wish I was home because at 3 o'clock, the Mets game's on TV. And I can turn on the Mets game while I'm working. I can't do that now. I can track it on the computer, but it's not the same. So there's certain advantages, and you just have to make it work. A lot of people don't go down anymore. They're all working at home. It's nice in some cases, and people rebelling against coming back. And it really depends, I guess, your own. You got to be disciplined. You want to have an editor keep track of you. But I haven't had an editor working in the same office as me in many, many years. I had when I was at Bloomberg and the AP, yes. But when I was in Albany for Syracuse, I was in Washington for Syracuse, and Washington for the Star-Ledger, in Washington now for Pittsburgh. My editor is hundreds of miles away. So I'm not with them anyway. We're just communicating. Now we communicate on the web. Used to be you communicated on landline before. But it works, and you make it work, and you work out something you can both you and your boss find works for both of you.
So you mentioned sports and you mentioned the Mets, and I'm familiar with your lifelong love of Mr. Met. I'm curious what your thoughts are about sports reporting. You know, I'm astonished that sports reporters are disappearing from TV stations. I mean, the sports report used to be a thing, and I understand people consume their sports reporting different ways now. A lot of it is probably fan-based. What has that done to the culture of sport in America by not having, Haywood Hale Brune anymore reporting about sport? And now the channels for delivery are so different and so paywalled. You have any thoughts on that, Jonathan?
Well, Haywood Hale Brune was a legend was a legendary sports reporter. He once a week on Saturday night on the CBS Evening News, he would do a off-the-wall sports report. Nobody does it anymore. Occasionally, the Athletic, which I subscribe to, get Mets coverage. They have some stories like that. They would try to do the National, which was a national sports magazine, a national sports paper daily, with the great sports writers of our generation.
Right.
But right now, when I want to get the Mets score, I can look on my phone. I can look on the computer. I don't have to wait till 11 o'clock to find out who won.
Right.
And the sports run by itself is different. You don't need the results anymore. The results are old news by the time you pick up the next day's newspaper. Mm-hmm. They're old news an hour afterwards. So you need to find other things to write about. The problem becomes is that a lot of the sites are team owned or industry owned. Mm. And I don't know how much freedom they have to write certain things. Because you're criticizing the boss that you're criticizing the people who pay you, or even if you can do it, it's self-censorship because you don't want to write that. You don't want to be that guy who writes that story and loses your job. So that's part of it. I mean, there are a couple of ESPN. They have a really good investigative unit that they took people away from the New York Times for. Mm-hmm. That comes to mind. I mean, it's getting some of the same stuff. It's just in a different venue. But again, you're not going to get the game stories because you don't need the game stories. You need the stuff that other people aren't writing. I first came to Washington. The sports on TV fawned over the Washington football team. God forbid they should talk about the fact that it was a racial slur. God forbid they should talk about the fact that the only reason there were even African Americans on the team is the federal government threatened to evict them from the stadium unless they hired them. They didn't talk about that. They just talked about how great they were and isn't it wonderful and everybody's wearing burgundy and gold and things like that. And then I'm turning on the sports report. I want to get the Mets score. They're in the middle of a pennant race. Yeah. And they don't give the baseball scores. Hello?
So you have to go outside with your little AM radio and hope at night you can pick up WCBS over the air.
Well, you can. You can get in your car at night, and that's the Mets station. I do listen to games here. But if you look at the TV sports reporters now, a lot of it, they have a ticker at the bottom with the sports scores. So at least you can get it that way. But, it was all hometown. And frankly, I thought it was cheerleaders.
You're absolutely right about DC. So I came back to town after college in 1983, and it was the year that the Redskins were going to play the Raiders in the '84 Super Bowl, and the sports reporters in the week run up were such homers, and they were, this is going to be a blowout, this is going to be great, and thud. Washington didn't even score a touchdown in that game. They scored 3 field goals, and they lost 38-9. That was sobering, and I again, another memory about what happens when so-called reporters aren't impartial. It does cloud things for sure.
Well, I got to cover the the 2019 World Series here. Because I talked to my sports editor. I said, my desk at the Capitol is a 20-minute walk from Nats Park. I can help out with sports coverage. I figured I'd have your main reporter down here. They send me in. I can help pull quotes and get quotes for the reporter and help them out, because everybody could use somebody to help them out getting stuff, checking facts, whatever. I figured, why not? I get to go be the World Series in the playoffs. Like, they give me credentials for everything. For the playoffs, because they figured if the Yankees, like the Jersey paper, they figured the Yankees make the World Series, we want to know about who the opponent is, if it's the Washington Nationals. So we'll have somebody who knows the Nationals. So I go down there and I do the story, and I'm in the locker room when they win the wild card, and I get spritzed with champagne. And everybody who's an experienced sports reporter knows you bring a hat, you bring a raincoat.
Right, and you got soaked.
What do I know? But then the Yankees don't make the World Series, so my sports editor says, you just cover it for us. I don't need to send a reporter down here. We don't care. You're not writing the game story anyway. You're writing other stories.
Right.
But my first press conference is the playoffs between the Los Angeles Dodgers and the Nationals.
Right.
My first question, my first sports press conference. What's it like being in the only place in Washington where they're not talking impeachment?
Right.
Who else but a political reporter is going to ask that question at a sports press conference? And we did some wonderful stories. I looked at who the players who gave campaign donations, the politicians. And I wrote, we wrote a lot of the different sports stuff, the baby shark phenomenon. I got to talk to
that was crazy. That was crazy.
I do the interview up. That was a story I liked a lot. I did a piece on the 3 Nationals who were released during the season by their former teams. And all of a sudden they're playing in the World Series. What's that like? Because it's different. I'm thinking from a different perspective, because I'm not a sports reporter. I got some really good coverage from that.
And I remember those posts, and what I remembered most about it was your just innate curiosity about it all. And it was fascinating to me because I was not bored with any of it. It was the kind of stuff that I would be asking. Jonathan, this has been absolutely phenomenal. We've run out of time, but I have one more question to ask you, and that is, what is your work fit? What attribute, condition, experience, place, or state of mind makes work a part of your day doing many meaningful things and not the all-consuming day? What's your work fit, Jonathan?
Well, I consider it, first of all, you always say journalism was the first draft of history. I'm getting to see things and go to places that nobody else gets to do. And I can say I was there. Nancy Pelosi, the House Speaker, announced she would now leave leadership. I went into the gallery to listen to that speech. I was there for 3 impeachments, Clinton and Trump twice. Actually, Trump's second impeachment was during COVID. I was watching it from home. I was there for the first impeachment of Trump. I was there for the Clinton impeachment. I'm watching American history that my son and his kids are going to read about in the history book. And I was there. I mentioned the White House, with the handshake between Rabin and Arafat. You're covering some of the presidential elections. You're covering history, and that's really what's very heady about journalism. But the other thing is, it's not a job if you want to punch a clock. It's not a 9-to-5 job. I'm very proud of the fact I had a son. I have a son. He's almost 26 now. But when he was in high school, junior high school, and elementary school, I never missed an important engagement with him. I always had time for him. Even the 5 years I was a single parent, I was always there. And despite the journalism, I made sure I carved out time. And that I'm very proud of. But when we went away to college, 2016, and I'm working 7-day weeks covering the campaign, I was glad he was at college because I could do that. But there are too many people, and I see them. We need to meet 7:00. We need to meet tonight to plan because we have something big the next day. No, it's after 6. I'm going home. No. You can't. It's not a clock punching profession. If you're not interested in that, you don't go into like daily journalism. Become a magazine writer if you want to write. Do a million other things. Become a novelist. Become a whatever. But you want to cover the news. The news doesn't ask for your schedule. You got to work around their schedule, not the other way around.
So, Jonathan, where can we find your byline? Point us on the web.
Right now, it's post-gazette.com. There's a paywall for certain things, but it's really cheap to order online anyway. I tweet everything out at JD Salant. I'm LinkedIn under my name. I'm on some of the other social media sites. I'm at Post now. I'm at the Mastodon, because the Twitter alternative. I'm on both of those sites, and I have a journalism link, a journalism Facebook page that I try to remember to post my stories on. If you're not my Facebook friend, but I'm all over the place.
Thank you so much for this. This has been fascinating. I really appreciate your time today, Jonathan, and best of luck to you in your new role.
Well, thank you very much.